Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland, welcome back to my channel, and it's day 16 of the Russo-Ukrainian war, if memory serves, and it's still scintillating. I hate to say it. I imagine public fascination with it will dip, as will mine, as it wears on. So remember, the late Tony Benn, not someone for whom I had a great deal of respect, said as a Air Force pilot in the Second World War, the war was 1% terror and 99% tedium. Well, we haven't really got to the tedium yet. But I propose to first of all talk today about the impact this is having on Russia's economy, and let's just say it's not good, because Putin severely underestimated the severity of the sanctions that would be imposed. He might have thought the West was bluffing. He'd called the West bluff a number of times. They'd drawn red lines. He'd crossed those lines. He hadn't faced serious consequences for that. Since at least 2007, the Russian Air Force has been violating British airspace, and they've just been ticked off by the UK, and the UK done nothing about it. I remember one of my teenage pupils at the time saying, "We'll just shoot down the plane." I was saying, "Whoa, don't do that. We don't want a third world war. Come on, let's don't overreact." So Putin's stratagem will be to break the boundary by an inch, and another, and another, and another, and see when he gets serious pushback. And no, deny. No, I never did that. But when it comes to, obviously, murdering dissidents at home in Russia, and more and more and more of them, and abroad, Russians are abroad, Russians who become foreign citizens abroad, and so on. And what can he get away with? But all the time disclaiming responsibility, nothing to do with me. What about pattern recognition? Isn't it curious the way those who criticise him so often meet a very premature and a very violent death? You'd have to be staggeringly stupid not to realise what's going on there. But anyway, President Putin said yesterday, the 10th of March, that his government's going to take swift and firm action over those 250 or more foreign companies which have either withdrawn from Russia altogether or suspended operations. So he says he shan't permit local suppliers to lose out. And he's going to take these businesses, confiscate them without compensation, and hand them over to those who can run them. And that this Russian state bank is going to manage it all. Now, that would be the biggest economic shake-up since the end of communism. Hello there, Shala Milorava. Where are you speaking to me from? So it's widely agreed that Russia is teetering on the brink of an economic precipice. The ruble is falling off a cliff. It may well reach 200 to the dollar within a month. So President Putin wanted to rebuild the USSR, and he's doing it, but not in the way he envisaged, economically, turning it into a basket case again. And one of his most blindly loyal oligarchs, Vladimir Potanin, publicly warned that nationalisation will be calamitous. From my home country, Georgia, I would really like to come back to Georgia, or Sakartvelo, shall I say, where we can travel. Well, we can travel freely about now. Slightly worried that, that Putin might be paying you a visit. And I thought, should the United States even rush troops to Georgia so that can't happen, even though it's not a member of NATO, but also demonstrate to Putin that this has boomeranged on him. He wanted to keep American troops further away. He hasn't. He's brought them closer. There are other ways to demonstrate that he's failed. If Republic of Ireland, if we join NATO, Sweden, Finland, anything like that. So I think Putin's indifferent to economic policy. Frankly, the topic bores him. Instead, he cares about beefing up the military, his robust foreign policy, oppressing his people at home. That's what rings his bell, grandeur. Hello. Does he want the whole of Ukraine? I suppose in his darkest fantasies, yes. But I think what he would settle for is recognition that Crimea is his, and then indeed Donbass and Luhansk, but maybe another slice of Ukraine, a bit more of the east, or maybe just a bit north of Kiev, so that the Ukrainians would know that if they have nominal independence, if they ever irk him again, that he can easily wreck their country. So if he could have a pliant president in Kiev, that would suit him just fine, to make it unofficially an extension of Russia, like he's trying to turn Belarus into. And that's another thing. So a Russian false flag attack on Belarus, bombing some villages, and then blaming on the Ukrainians as a pretext to try and drag Belarus into the war. And the Ukrainians said it's not them. Why on earth would Belarus do that? I know that that Belarus has expedited this attack on Ukraine, but Ukraine does not need more enemies. They're already outnumbered, well, by the Russians 4-1. Admittedly, most of the Russian army is not there. In heavy equipment, they're outnumbered 10-1. They would not be doing this. It just fails the reality test. No matter how risible, no matter how ludicrous, the Putin regime will tell these lies. So the Russian government's going to introduce food price controls. They did this a bit during lockdown, and that means that the profits for farms are low to non-existent, and so return to the Soviet era of empty shelves. Yes, the price is very low, but that doesn't help you if there's no food to buy. I'm not saying there was no food whatsoever. I mean, nobody starved to death there, not since the 1950s. Some of the measures could be good as an emergency thing, and the situation's exigent as a short-term thing, but if they became long-term, they'd have an even more deleterious impact on the economy than doing nothing, than just letting the market do what it will. So business is lamenting the fact the government has got no coherent plan. How did they not foresee this? Why didn't they not develop a contingency plan? Well, this was not thought through. They didn't think that tough sanctions were going to come. So they talked about tax breaks and credit holidays, but that will make the public exchequer situation even more parlous. That will mean that the banks or whoever's lending money, their situation is going to be even more dreadful. Some of the banks are gonna fold. You know, Aeroflot, most airlines are going to go bust. They've lost about 50% of their destinations. They cannot get the transponders they need. Another thing is insurance is going to be a big problem. Maybe the world insurance market could cut them off. I mean, even today, Biden announced in the United States is banning the purchase of Russian vodka and other goods. And the other Russian the things they sell are potash, which is a fertilizer. So does Belarus, more chemicals, maybe more metals like nickel, but that'll make construction and so on more expensive. One thing is, in the Western world, we need prosperity without growth. Just stop buying more junk than we need. This rampant consumerism, which is so often funding tyranny, because as ill luck will have it, most of the hydrocarbons happen to lie in tyrannical states. And everything we buy, that's energy. You know, the cotton for this shirt, that was a tractor, that's oil. That farmed the cotton. Then it was a factory powered by oil, possibly gas or coal, which turned it into a shirt. And then when it's transported by train, truck, and ship, that's more oil. So anyway, so there's going to be some sort of state support for major businesses in Russia, those that are structurally important, as they say, as happened during lockdown. As usual, small and medium enterprises get neglected, so it's the government picking winners in its just nepotism, really. Semi-state companies, them getting helped out, no doubt kickbacks to the officials that make the decision. There'll be paperwork as long as your arm to get the grant that the small businesses can't cope with. So the guy who's got a shoe repair business, yeah, he can starve, but massive corporations, the very wealthy executives, they'll always be bailed out. It's the same in every country. So the Moscow Stock Exchange has been closed for 10 days because the government fears there's going to be such panic selling when it reopens. Well, they're making it even worse. Is it ever going to reopen? The Central Bank of Russia says they're going to provide unlimited liquidity to banks, but then could the Central Bank of Russia eventually go under? It's a very high-risk strategy. So economists forecast that Russian GDP is going to fall at least 10% this year. It was rising by 1 or 2% per annum since 2014. So the United Russia Party, that's the major party, Putin's fan club, says that sanctions by these Western countries are tantamount to economic warfare. Well, that's not as bad as real warfare, which Russia is visiting upon the luckless Ukrainians. So bellicose rhetoric from these established politicians is no substitute for some sort of workable plan to avert the economic catastrophe that they're staring in the face. So there's only one way that Russia could end all these sanctions. It's the one thing the Russian government refuses to consider, and that is immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Ukraine. You know, they could be so much better off. I really feel for ordinary Russians, because trillions have been stolen or squandered by Putin and his cronies since he came into office as Prime Minister first time in 1999. And I really mean trillions of dollars, about various tax rebate frauds, money ripped off the public, money squandered on the military, and the effect of sanctions that they've caused. Not that the military even functions well. It's not a contemptible little army, it's a contemptible large army. Not saying all the soldiers are bad, and I'd be absolutely useless as a soldier, but they've not executed their plan very well. It reminds me of what Omar Bradley said in the Second World War, that American general, that amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics. That you could have the most marvelous maneuvers in the world, a fantastic strategy, but if your logistics can't support that, it's not going to work, it's not going to happen, because you won't have the ammunition, fuel and food you need to execute your strategy. And you can't necessarily count on living off the land, Taking it off the civilian population, they may not have it, or they might destroy these things. Taking it off the enemy, well, they might have destroyed it, or might have been destroyed in combat or whatever. Anyway, so Moscow pursued this rather tight fiscal policy, a very conservative one, for decades. Low spending and prudence, except on the military, where money was lavished. Putin just spent like a sailor on that one, on these super fast missiles. $150 billion a year, making the fourth highest military budget in the world. But billions of dollars worth of military assets have been destroyed fighting in Ukraine. So some say that Russia's facing an economic crisis on the scale of the 1990s. I don't think it's going to be quite that severe. Anyway, back in the 90s, at least Western countries bailed Russia out, something Putin conveniently forgets. Why did Russia avoid total meltdown? Because the United States, Canada, Germany, the UK, France, even Japan, not that Japan's Western, they saved the day. They rode to the rescue. Admittedly, that wasn't entirely altruistic, because they said if Russia breaks up, they'll be selling weapons, including nukes, everywhere. There's anything they got. Will ordinary Russians just sit back and expect to be kicked back to 1991? Good question. Well, they're going to sort of have to, because Putin's got his eyes and ears everywhere. He's got the FSB, that's his secret police. They've got face recognition technology from the Chinese. They're monitoring the internet. It's very oppressive. So you'd have to be very, very brave to stand up. And, you know, if you protest, that's a $300 fine. That's a month's salary for most Russians. Black mark against your name, you lose your job. Second offence, it's jail for a few days, and then third offence, longer and longer prison sentences. Some people are leaving the country. He's got no objection to that. That's changed in the Soviet era because he sees these people as a problem, get them out. There's a brain drain, highly educated young people leaving the country, the sort of people they really need to hang on to. So depends how terrible it gets. If there's actual malnutrition, then we might see mass unrest on the scale that we saw in Kazakhstan in January this year. But Putin's got the perfect prescription for that. You just shoot them all dead. He thought that Tiananmen Square, that was the right thing to do, that the Chinese tyrants, that they murdered thousands of their young people for peacefully protesting, and Putin would do exactly the same. He was in Dresden, East Germany, 1989. He was aghast that this dictatorship very, very quickly. And he said because they weren't willing to use massive scale and massive force, a huge scale force at a very early stage, nip it in the bud. People are not allowed to communicate their opinions or even the truth very much. But so he's got almost total control of the media, but I think increasingly people know the truth, and people will go abroad and will hear the truth a little bit. So I think his hyper-nationalism, his militarism, that's doesn't have very much purchase. His approval rating is 44%, about the same as Biden's. But the 44% is deeply unimpressive if you've got total control of the media. So unemployment is going to shoot up. Tens of thousands of Russians are losing their jobs because the Western companies they work for are laying them off. Now, admittedly, tens of thousands in a country of 140 million is not that many. They will lay off, and more companies are going to crater. They'll lay off these guest workers from former Soviet countries like Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia and so on. They're the last to be hired, first to be fired. But that could cause such hardship in those former Soviet republics, that could lead to mass unrest there, exactly what Putin doesn't want. So he's really shot himself in the foot. Anyway, so the fall of the ruble has meant businesses have really lost all confidence. Consumer spending is going to dry up. People don't have much of a disposable income. So it's a pretty all-round bleak situation. And so much for Chinese friendship. The Chinese-dominated Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is not going to lend to Russia. And Russia's debt rating is junk. It's just completely uncreditworthy. So some companies are going to be allowed to default on their debt. The state might sequester the property of foreign investors, but Western companies had far less invested in Russia than Russia had invested in Western countries. About $1.1 trillion of Russian assets in NATO countries, and there was perhaps a tenth of that of NATO countries in Russia. So, if Russia starts confiscating all these businesses without compensation, I think there'll be irreparable reputational damage. If things ever return to normal, I think investors are going to be very slow and very circumspect about re-entering the Russian market. So it's really a disaster made for Putin in the Kremlin. And then as he's absolutely trashing Ukraine, the bit he takes over, what's it going to be? A heap of rubble? I mean, it's not very economically strong anyway. It's got very little oil or gas, a little bit of coal. He controls that in Donbass anyway. Not much metal. Okay, it's got farmland, wheat, and his Chinese chums are hacked off because they bought a lot of their wheat from Ukraine and not going to get it this year. So wheat prices are up, oil and gas prices are up. The UAE is at least saying they'll pump more oil, and that'll mean the price won't go up as much as it is. But the UAE doesn't even have that much oil. So it's a pretty dreadful situation. But he really doesn't care about the lives of ordinary people. Otherwise, he wouldn't have robbed them blind. He would care about it when that might be a threat to his continuation in power. Well, thank you for watching my channel. I got to log off now. Toodaloo.